Good morning, my name is Itai. I'm the Deputy for Research and Analysis here in the INSS, and I'll be moderating the first panel. And this panel is about Russia in the international arena and in the Middle East. And following what Udi and Alexander were saying, because the conference has another panel on Russia and the Middle East politics, an additional panel on Russia and Israel in the changing Middle East, I think that it will be wise if we will concentrate on the first panel on the international arena, the struggle over the world order or disorder, and from this perspective we will look at the Middle East. So I'm honored to invite our distinguished guests to the stage. The first is Dr. Dimitri Mariassis. Dimitri is the head of the Israel, you can come to the stage. Dimitri is the head of the Israel Department and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Science at Skolkovo Business School Institute for Emerging Market Studies. He also serves as the Director General of the Russian Israel Business Council. Previously, he was a guest lecturer at the Institute of Asian and African Studies at the Moscow Lomonosov State University. Mariassis is an expert in the economics and politics of contemporary Israel and has authored many research papers and books. Next is Ms. Oksana Antonenko. Oksana is the Director for Global Risk Analysis at Control Risk Group. Her work focuses on Europe, including Russia and Central Asia, as well as Africa and the Middle East. Previously, she was a senior political counselor at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. She advised the bank's senior management and the board on political trends and governance issues in Russia and other markets. She was also a senior fellow and program director for Russia and Eurasia at the IISS. She holds degrees from Harvard University and Moscow State University. And the third is Dr. Irvin Studin. Irvin is the president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Global Brief magazine. He has been a professor in leading universities in North America, Asia, and Europe. He is the co-founder of Ukraine Higher School of Public Administration in Kiev, and is a member of the External Advisory Board of the Canadian Foreign Service Institute, Canada's diplomatic academy, which prepares Canada diplomats for the challenges of the 21st century. And the fourth member of the panel is the only one that I'm sure I pronounce his name correctly. Is Colonel retired Dr. Eran Lerman. Eran is the Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He was the Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council in the Israeli Prime Minister Office. He held senior posts in the IDF military intelligence for 20 years. He also served for 8 years as the Director of Israel and Middle East Office of the American Jewish Committee. He teaches in various places and holds PhD from the London School of Economics. So with that, few opening words on Russia and the international arena. In about a month, we are going to publish the INSS Strategic Assessment for 2020, our annual strategic assessment. And in that assessment, I think in accordance with the conventional wisdom, we are going to describe some kind of a strategic, multidimensional competition between the superpowers. And I think this is an accepted wisdom that there is such a competition. But there are two different narratives concerning the essence of the competition. And we're offering both of them because they are not contradicting each other. The first narrative, I think this is the most accepted narrative, is that this competition is about influence, is about dominance, is about power, is about resources. This is the realpolitik narrative. And according to this narrative, the United States is still the most powerful nation in the world in terms of resources, capabilities, but it is led by President Trump, converging into its more narrow interests. It is entering a turbulent election year in the shadow of the impeachment process, which will probably empower current existing trends of polarization, volatility, and a separatist approach aimed on reducing investment and activity in the foreign arena, except maybe for short-term political gains. The United States withdrawal from the position of global policeman, according to this narrative, creates a vacuum that various forces seek to exploit, each in its own way. China is currently not interested in leading the world, in replacing the United States as the leader of the world. It is leveraging its economic power. It has gained in the last few years for political influence and rising military power, but its growth rate is slowing, and it is also facing problems in the internal arena, so it is allocating resources to tightening its control on the inner arena. China is interested and active in the Middle East, but it is focusing mainly on the economic aspect of being here in the Middle East. Russia is still very far away from achieving superpower capabilities, but according to this accepted narrative, Putin seeks to restore Russia's Tsarist magnitude and the position that it enjoyed for centuries in the international arena. In Russia's view, the American dominance after the end of the Cold War was an anomaly that allowed the United States to implement tools, sanctions, interventions, information warfare, in order to promote its interests at the expense of other actors in the international system, and of course, mainly, especially, at the expense of Russia itself. So Russia, according to this narrative, is working to change this reality and to regain the status which is considered appropriate of a global superpower to be considered and respected in the international arena. Putin understands that Russia is unable to compete economically with the United States or China, so he advocates some kind of a multipolar world in which Russia, as one of the leading superpowers, would have special rights that would also include recognition of its sphere of influence. So according to this narrative, Russia is partly and limitedly filling these spaces created by the American withdrawal from the Middle East. So this is one narrative. There is another narrative, a different narrative, according to which this competition has a more ideological aspect. In an interview with the Financial Times on June this year, during the G20 Osaka summit, Putin said that every crime must have its punishment. The liberal idea has become obsolete. It has come into conflict with the interests of the overwhelming majority of the population. So according to this narrative, the more ideological narrative, we are 30 years after the dramatic events of 1989, 30 years after Fukuyama, end of history, and there is currently no single global enemy to the Western liberal democratic idea, such as communism, that represents a viable opposing ideological global alternative. However, according to this narrative, liberal democracy is dealing with different enemies that are hostile to its values and challenge its institutions. According to this narrative, Putin is one of those who are fighting against the democratic liberal order and maybe even offer a different order, a different illiberal alternative order, both to the international system and to the various nation states. When Putin talks about the problems of the liberal democratic idea, he refers to the three arenas in which this struggle is being conducted, takes place. First, on the world order between the superpowers. Second, within the democratic states. And third, within the autocratic states between the public and the rulers. So, with that, we are very curious to hear the opinions of the panelists about these narratives or other narratives, and how they can explain Russia's activities in the international global arena and in the Middle East regional arena. The starting point, as was said before, can be Russia's balance of achievements, 5 years since 2014, Ukraine, and 4 years since Syria, since the involvement in Syria. What were Russia's goals back then and how they are now? Were they achieved? How satisfied are the Russians with the state of affairs since 2014? So I think we will start with Dmitry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be here and a pleasure for being invited here, because I think INSS is for the institute that I work for is our partner, and it is always interesting and good to be here presenting. So let's consider the questions. Of course, there is no black and white issue, so we cannot answer them in you are right or you are not right. That's generally. The thing that I would say that, of course, since 2000s, Russia is claiming to regain its world power position. I wouldn't call it superpower, but I would call it the world power position. And it means that Russia has to, as it is looked from the Russian side, to operate in different parts of the world, not necessarily in the Middle East. Of course, with this, Russia, to my opinion, is working hard to rethink, its position toward different actors in the world, in different parts of the world, and of course towards different powers and who pretend to be world powers or superpowers in the world, of course. And in many ways it is competition. But I would say that if we look, for example, in the Middle East, Russia tries to find its new role in the region, and I would say that the major idea here is to be a true mediator, a true middleman, if you would like to say, between all the parties of the different conflicts, not only conflict. I mean, it's if we look at the Middle East, there are different kinds of conflicts in the region. So in all these conflicts, Russia tries to be, let's say, a mediator that has potential good working relations with the all parties involved, and to try to resolve, more or less to resolve it. It would be very easy to say, somehow to normalize the situation. Of course, it's true that economically speaking, Russia cannot afford to be to play the same role as the US or potentially China, if it would elaborate more not only on economic issues but on political influence. Of course, Russia today's Russia economically is unable to fulfill it, but on politically and strategically, Russia really tries to take these, let's say, white places that, for example, when the previous administration of United States, and in some way current administration, leaves open spaces that Russia is ready to take and to be involved in. And of course, it is in a way it is a competition. But as for the second narrative, I would say that maybe Russia is the interesting mixture of the Western world and of the Eastern world, even geographically. Look at the map, and culturally as well. So Russia is comprising partially the European political culture and culture as it is, and partially the Eastern culture, because okay, Russia just has a very let's say wide representation of the populations with the inbuilt Eastern cultures, including the political cultures as well. And liberal and or anti-liberal and these issues, I wouldn't say that it's a right way to describe this. We also, if we look at the map, we will see that trying to impose liberal instruments without teaching and let's say making a real liberal set of values in different places of the world brings to disaster, to catastrophe. If you make an election just because it is a liberal system or it is a general election, and you make an election and suddenly you see that there is a not nice westernized guy takes place as the leader, you just feel that maybe the elections is the tool, but not the set of values it is. If you want to change something, you have to change the set of values, and you have to start with it, but not with the election, because we have to think about it. And one thing. Another thing, if we speak about liberal ideology as it is looked from the Russian side as well, you have to admit one of the major liberal values is to acknowledge that there are different opinions and values to your values. So if you try to impose your values to the people who are not agree with your own values, it's not very liberal by itself. It is an important notion that is vividly seen all over the world, and in Russia it is acknowledged because there are different countries with different political cultures, with different sets of values, and you have to admit it. And in this case, you say just about Putin, but Putin still is not the whole Russia, is it all? Among different layers of experts, scientists, researchers, politicians, there are different attitudes towards what's going on. But generally, there is a perception that I feel, I speak personally from my point of view as a researcher, as an expert, that what we see, that Russia understands that there is more colors than liberal or anti-liberal, and sometimes all these colors are mixed in one picture. And you can't just say this is how we used to be and this is vice versa. That's why you're either with us or you're our enemy. That's not the picture that we look upon. That's why we have to be more we have to work in more complicated situation. That's why we have to use different instruments and different attitudes towards the world. That's what Russia tries to show. And maybe I think this is the way. It doesn't mean that sometimes Russia doesn't contradict to values that it sets Western values and so on. Maybe. But it's a point of it's a point of discussion, but not of making a red line this or anti this. By this, I would end.
Irvin?
Boker Tov, Shalom mi Canada. How's my English? It's okay? It's perfect. My English is perfect. Canadian English is very neutral, so it's a real pleasure to be back in Israel. I was telling our moderator, I believe that my second time in Israel was for the Maccabiah in 1997. Remember when the bridge collapsed? I played Kadurregel for Canada. Hapoel Ashkelon wanted to offer me a contract, but my father said, come back to university. So it's a real pleasure, and I want to thank Vera and Tzvi again for the invitation. We've collaborated in the past in Canada, and I really admire the work of INSS. So there are very few institutes of this scale in the world, and for a small country like Israel, you should be very proud. I only see institutes of this scale in the United States and in China. Even Russia doesn't have institutes of this scale. The Soviet Union did, but so congratulations and keep up the good work. And this fine conference speaks to the ongoing curiosity of Israel about very complicated topics. Second point is that whenever I come to a foreign conference, I'm cognizant of the fact that I'm an outsider. I'm an outsider to Russia, I'm an outsider to the Middle East. So, as we say in Russian, я скромничаю. I'm very humble. I will give parametric observations, and I think they approximate some truths related to Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, and the North American, Western Europe. But I'm still cognizant of the fact that I don't feel it intimately. I don't have your reality. So, with that being said, Tolstoy said, you will know in Anna Karenina, that all happy families are happy in the same way, but they are unhappy in different ways. So the key year is not 1990, 91, it is not 2000, I think, as Dima said, it was not anything early. Of course, there's a prehistory to everything, but the year of reference for our purposes in understanding Russian behavior is only 2014. Because at that period, there were 3 houses radicalized. And while they were reasonably coherent in similar ways, they were radicalized in very different ways. After the Ukrainian Revolution, and first I talk about the revolution before the annexation of Crimea. After the Ukrainian Revolution, and then the annexation of Crimea, and then the war in the Donbass, the 3 houses radicalized were first and foremost Ukraine, within itself, and then against Russia. Russia against Ukraine and against the West, and particularly after the Krim Nash euphoria, after the annexation. And in my view, the most radicalized was us in the West. And I'm speaking in particular about the Anglo-spheric West, the United States, Britain, and us in Canada. To a lesser extent, Germany, Poland, France, right? This was a strange annexation because I mentioned the different dimensions of the annexation, but in the West it was a humorless annexation. I mean, we did lose all our sense of humor on a topic that required a lot of nuance to understand and continues to require nuance and sense of irony. The Ukrainians were tragically radicalized, but still maintain their very Jewish sense of humor. I mean, the Ukrainians are, in my experience, the funniest people in the world, alongside the Jews, and their humor is very Jewish. This might not be the Ukraine you know, but is the Ukraine intimately, psychologically, very funny. And the Russians are a little bit less funny, but maintain their sense of irony about the future. That you can ask the Russians, "Что будет завтра?" What will happen tomorrow? Oh no, what will happen in 2 years' time? And they said, that's very, very far. We cannot tell you what will happen in a month. Right? And so I will speak a little bit to the capacity for long-term planning of Russia, including in the Middle East, and maybe that's a bit exaggerated. So keep in mind, we are 3 houses radicalized, and they continue to be radicalized. But I still think in the West, in North America in particular, and Western Europe, we are still the most radical. The Trump phenomenon, in my view, is a continuation of that radicalization that starts in 2014. It's a humorless radicalization. Brexit is a continuation to some extent of that radicalization, also humorless for very funny people. And when the Americans speak about Russia and today Ukraine, they are not really speaking at all about the countries as such. They are speaking with diminishing knowledge over time, and it's really about a domestic process in which Russia becomes a tag for a certain political tribe or ideological tribe, and now Ukraine, and whichever other country. But in my view, still a continuation of radicalization which didn't exist between 2014. You recall that just before the Ukrainian revolution, Ukraine and Poland had calmly hosted the European Championship of soccer. Everyone was calm. The Ukrainians would say, I would ask them, well, first I would say, just to speak to Ukrainian humor, I would say, как у вас дела в Киеве? Все по плану. How is everything in Kiev? Everything is according to plan. Где план? Нет плана. Where's the plan? No, there's no plan. And then the other one would be, как у вас в Киеве дела? Наверное, у вас лучше. How is everything in Kiev? It's probably better where you are. Right? But they would say, after Putin came in 2012 as prime minister, they would say, how did it go? And they say, we went our way, the Russians went their way, calmly, transactionally, before the radicalization. So that's the first point. We're in a radicalized period. I think the West is still the most radicalized. Ukraine is confused and radicalized, and Russia has de-radicalized somewhat, and because of the Middle Eastern energy, has been able to divert some of that radical energy into other fields, including the Asia pivot with China, to which we can return a little bit later. Second point is that there are three conflicts in the world in which the Middle East finds itself as only one. The first conflict is the Russia-Western conflict. It is still the most important conflict for understanding the future of Russia's behavior in the Middle East. That is, Russia's behavior in the Middle East will turn not on the fate of Syria, not on the fate of Iran or Yemen or Libya, but it will turn on its position vis-a-vis the former Soviet space, vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis the United States. So the Russia-Western conflict starting in 2014. The second major conflict is the total collapse of the Middle East order after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Of course, there are all sorts of smaller conflicts related to that, and the Israeli-Arab conflict is much older, as you know, much more intimately. But the general logic and coherence of the Middle East breaks down in 2003. Those two conflicts join at the hip, obviously, in 2015 with the Russian intervention in Syria. And the third conflict, which is not yet mentioned, is the conflict that really took place in 2016. That's the bras de fer, the collision between the United States and China. That is not yet manifesting itself, or its tentacles are not yet manifesting themselves in the Middle East, but in the Russia-Western conflict, it is very powerful. I can speak from the Canadian perspective that we are caught in between these two giants. Canada is actually geographically quite close to China. We're close to Russia in the Arctic, and we have a long border with the United States. So the China conflict those are three conflicts. Two of them, in my view, have some solutions. Actually, our institute, the Institute for 21st Century Questions, has been a leader in floating some of those solutions. So I want to just quickly return to those, and then I'll have some concluding remarks. The China-United States and China-Western conflict, in my view, is quite artificial and amplified, but it has no resolution in the near future, and it's taken on its own energy. It's quite irrational. For the Russia-Ukraine, Russia-Western conflict, if the solution hasn't passed, then it does start with the work that we started on the injection of peacekeepers in Donbass. The peacekeeping idea comes directly from our work in 2014, 2015. Tzvi was even at an early conference in 2016. The peacekeepers are not some random intervention. The idea is to change the energy of that conflict through a new power and to break the security conflict. And the new power must be non-NATO, it must be non-CSTO, not from the former Soviet space. It must be a neutral country from a neutral continent, and that can only be Asia. Which country? Well, maybe India, and maybe Indonesia. And if I want to be humorous, maybe Israel. It would be very interesting to have Jewish peacekeepers between Slavic forces. But the peacekeepers change the energy, break the conflict, and then allow for a political superstructure, which includes the removal of sanctions, which is very difficult now, not only because technically sanctions can't be reversed in some parts of the world, but also because the Russians have grown used to sanctions psychologically, and they don't believe that they will be removed anytime soon. But also because if Ukraine does collapse some point in late Zelensky or in the transition from Zelensky, then that will break all the conflicts and re-radicalize Ukraine, re-radicalize Russia, re-radicalize the West, and also create chaos in the Middle East because it will endanger some of the stability in Russia. And of course, that superstructure also involves things like the reforms to the constitution of Ukraine, NATO status, and a general rebuilding package for which Asia has money. The Middle East conflict, in my view, and this is not a view held in Israel, but one of the most original propositions comes from a work on my colleague at the Institute for 21st Century Questions, who is a Canadian, but of Iranian background. By the way, Canada has communities from all over the world, but they're strictly Canadian. So when I say Iranian Canadian in Canada, in Israel, you're not to look at it as an Iranian. It's the same as an Italian Canadian. But the proposition is for a security framework for all of the Middle East that approximates ASEAN. It might start with a smaller grouping of countries, but the Middle East is one of the only regions in the world, strategic regions, without its own security framework, right? And you have all sorts of security dilemmas and all sorts of confidence mechanisms that are purely absent. Now, this proposition has now been championed by Russia, formally, China, and Iran. So it would be interesting to have some reflection on it by top thinkers in Israel, because I do think longer term that is the only way to stabilize some of the moving parts of this very difficult region. I want to just say a few things about Russia, and then I will yield. I'm not a big believer in any of the narratives, the macro narratives that were given at the start, with all due respect. They mostly come from the Western Academy. And I think you need to start more from the guts of the Russian and post-Soviet systems. First, these are all very new states. Russia is not an old country. It's a very new country. And Ukraine is maybe even a newer country because it has very little history, has no history of statehood. Belarus and Kazakhstan, I was recently Kyrgyz. These are all countries that are with new elites, that have inherited very complex geography, that have no ideology. I mean, Russia has no political ideology. So the idea that if Putin may speak about liberalism, and he is improvising. He's improvising ex post facto. It's in Russian, it's called поиск национальной идеи, the search for a national idea to keep the glue, to build a glue for a very difficult geography and a very difficult population. The same in Ukraine. Ukraine is just more homogeneous than Russia, but always is looking for поиск национальной идеи. What are we about? They don't have the strong ideology of the founding of Israel or the Jewish history, or even the warrior circumstances of the birth, even though they have very homogeneous population. And same thing with Belarus. That's the first point. The second point is, though, however, with Putin and with the inherited elite of the Soviet Union, Russia does take great power positions. But I want to use a different word, because great powers again goes to the idea that there are 3 or 4 great powers in the world and that Canada is a future great power or something like that. But in my view. But I like to say, instead of great power, I like to use the word term setting. Russia is a term setting power. When they move, they expect to set the logic of future processes and future dynamics. And when they see a contrary move by a power to set the logic, they will resist. Почему им подчиняться другим государствам? Why do they need to subordinate to American logic, Chinese logic, or someone else's logic? So in the Middle East, the same. Russia becomes a term-setting country by interjecting in Syria. And this gets to the next point, which is that Russia remains, although in a very unstable way, a very professional power in the Middle East, without ideology. If they have a goal, they have an algorithm, and they will execute quite professionally. I mean, they might have some of the unruliness of Russian culture and some of their institutional disorganization, but they remain professional, including in analytical expertise, and less ideological than us in the West. And I think, by the way, the Chinese are the least ideological. That's a different point. A couple of other things. Great capacity, Russia, for improvisation and scaling. So they can scale in a way that is unimaginable for both Israel, for Western countries, and only America and China can scale on that at that level and with such speed. So that explains the Crimean intervention, the Syrian intervention, very fast, very big, and sometimes with big mistakes. The last point is, and I think this was not mentioned, but the future of Russia in the Middle East is very difficult to foretell because of the dynamic with which I started, that Russia doesn't know what will happen in a year's time, because there's a succession problem in Russia. who is next? And when will next happen? Is it in 2 years' time? Is it in 4 years' time? Is it in 10 years' time, for whatever reason? But that dynamic has to be put into present value terms, and it impinges on everything, because if succession is unstable, then Russia retreats from the Middle East, much as it did at the collapse of the Soviet Union. It could also be an unfriendly succession. That is, you could have a much more ideological, maybe anti-Semitic succession, which is where right now it's quite pro-Semitic, right? But that is something that suggests that it's very difficult to tell where Russia will be 10 years from now in any of these conflicts. My wish is not that it be destabilized, but for professional, non-ideological engagement. Toda rabba.
Just a little thing. I wanted to start with a reference to something that reminds us that perhaps for us the determining years are 45 and 48, not 2014. And if once this is up, we need to remind ourselves that the Israeli perspective on the Russian and Soviet role in history is unique. I don't know how many of you recognize this. I'm talking even to Israelis, let alone guests from abroad. I happened to pass recently through the military cemetery in Jerusalem, and Har Herzl. And there is this monument with this number there, 200,000. This is the number of the approximate, rounded number of Jewish soldiers who died fighting in the ranks of the Red Army in the Great Patriotic War. That not only greatly outnumbers the sacrifice we have made here to establish our independence, it reminds us of certain aspects of history which color our perspective on the Russian, Soviet, and again Russian position in the world. True, there have been deeply wounding periods of hostility. Interestingly enough, in continuation of the conversation that has begun here already, part of it was because the rise or the reawakening of Jewish nationalism, the Zionist movement, particularly after 1967, posed a direct not only a strategic question in the Middle East, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also a strategic intellectual threat to the new Soviet man and the new Soviet idea. And the rise of Jewish nationalism was therefore the target of great hostility in the Brezhnev period. Paradoxically, today, as we heard, Russia is not only an adherent but a promoter of a deeper commitment to the national idea. So maybe even a national idea with certain religious colorings, certain Pravoslav colorings, which makes it much more easy to understand the current Israeli Zionist perspective and project. And this, I think, is very much at the core of the discussion now as to where Russia would lead itself in the world of the later 21st century. We learned from Thucydides that there are three great motives for conflict. There's honor, or in our case, anger, and revenge, perhaps. There is fear, and there is an interest. Clearly, questions of honor and of fear drive a Russian strategy, a Russian perception of the West as an enemy. Last year, I debriefed Israeli officers from the National Security College who visited Russia. There are 4 groups going to different countries, and one of the groups went to Russia. They were still in shock for the first slides they were presented with by their colleagues in the Russian equivalent, because these were slides of 2 hungry wolves with blood on their snouts, and these were the EU and NATO. Now, I think it takes it a bit far to look at the EU as a meat-eating animal of any sort. But the sense of fear, the sense of threat, is definitely coloring policy, I believe, in Moscow, as I see it. We never need to take out the economic side or the demographic side of the equation. Russia today is bracketed between a nation 10 times the population of Russia and an alliance 25 times the GDP of Russia. That's the proportion, economic proportion, between Russia and NATO. So we never need to take this out of the equation. And this is what has made, for example, the intervention in Syria, where Russia could take advantage of an opportunity, of a void created by others, to stake out a much, as they say in good English, to punch way above its weight and stake out this term-setting opportunity, this strategy to define the terms in a very important corner of the world. But this is part, obviously, of a much larger pattern. The question is, where does this lead us down the road? Paradoxically, I would say that the future of Syria actually creates a point down the road where Russia would have to make certain choices. There's one thing that Russia could do, which was to militarily save Assad's regime. By the way, this gave Israel an opportunity to have a conversation, and a very useful conversation, about the confliction, about our mutual interests and the management of these interests. And it was very striking that instead of basically telling us to stay out, a mechanism for deconfliction was established. I think it is a matter of public knowledge now that there is a hotline, a red line established between the IAF headquarters in Tel Aviv and the Russian airbase in Khmeimim. Even the Ilyushin incident did not change that. Clearly, of course, if something as silly and tragic happens as Russians being killed with a Russian weapon by people trained by Russians, it must be a Jewish conspiracy. But we know for a fact that even the Soviet military did not believe their own argument on this, because otherwise they would have terminated the relationship, which they did not. And after Norkin's visit, soon afterwards, things went back to normal, and they are manageable and managed. But having said all this, there's one thing the Russia of today cannot do. It cannot lift the burden of reconstructing a country destroyed to the ground by its own government, burned to a crisp by the Assad regime. This is beyond the capacity of the Russian economy to sustain. It needs either, and here you come to the fork in the road. Is it going to be China, which has, God knows, the money and the capacities, or a more Western-oriented coalition of elements? A dramatic question. It will require rethinking in the West as to what is the true interest in this context, because right now, of course, Assad is beyond the pale for very good and legitimate reasons. But this is just the beginning of a much larger question. Is Russian strategy going ultimately to rely on building a, forgive the pun, a bricks wall against the West? And I would say that by now that wall no longer exists. Neither Bolsonaro nor Modi are partners in a BRICS coalition effectively aimed at the West. South Africa is a curiosity. So ultimately, the choice would lead Russia, if that is the strategy, to becoming, and I'm saying this very bluntly, down the road, in a generation or less, an adjunct of imperial China. An energy, a Saudi Arabia to China's power. A supplier of energy, and by the way, we have already learned that the suppliers are very often the dependent party, and strategically in the shadow of growing Chinese ambitions. That's the choice. And I think it's in the interest of Russia, as well as in the interest of the West, to find ways to prevent this from happening. And to the extent that Israel can play a minor role in setting the agenda for this discussion, it is very much in our interest that this should not happen. Unfortunately, what could have been an intelligent discussion on this subject was vitiated in the last 4 years, 3 years, by aspects of American politics, which in an era of great polarization have targeted Trump as a Russian Manchurian candidate and then forced the American state to prove otherwise. Aspects of European policy that Mr. Bakker has already mentioned and Irvin mentioned. And also by, as I said, by sentiments and attitudes in Moscow which put the fear and honor above interest. And these things need to change, but we have to be cognizant that this is going to be a long process. We should not expect, and the Russians should not expect from us, to the extent that we can be of help, we cannot expect any early and quick results. But the existence of dialogue is absolutely vital. And I think Israel can take pride in that and this should have been mentioned here already, to have brought about the first ever meeting between Patrushev and Bolton. Bolton is no longer with us for various reasons, and we may never know what actually led to his fall until the next round of scurrilous books come out. But the very fact that Israel hosted this tripartite summit of Ben Shabbat, Patrushev, and Bolton was, to me, a significant event. And one last line. Talk has been until now about the Russian role in the Middle East. But I should say, personally, I'm running a campaign to finally get rid of the Middle East. That's an absurd notion that we still use British colonial terms to describe the place we live in. Israel is an Eastern Mediterranean country. Within the last 4 or 5 years, we've been building a close association with two countries which have traditionally been, for reasons that go beyond geopolitics and deep into aspects of identity, including Orthodox Christian identity, two countries which have long been favorably looked upon by Russia, even when one of them belonged to NATO and both of them belong to the EU, namely Greece and Cyprus. And I know firsthand that this development was looked upon quite favorably by serious people in Moscow. So here's another opportunity to look at points of commonality that rise amidst the present difficulties and confusions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's first of all, thank you, Vera and ISS for inviting me. It's a very interesting conference and a great opportunity to listen to colleagues, really fantastic presentations, and also to share some of my thoughts with you. It's of course very difficult to be the last speaker on the panel with so many interesting interventions and topics covered. So I might repeat some of the things that were mentioned, but maybe from my perspective, what I can really add is to develop a little bit on what Alexander said at the opening remarks. What is the European perspective, to the extent that there is a European perspective, and coming from the UK, it is perhaps not the obvious place to talk about the European perspective, but I'm a member of the EU-Russia Expert Network on Foreign Policy, and we discuss a lot of issues between Russians and the Europeans on a regular basis, and I have to tell you that the Middle East is the only subject on which I think there is, growing willingness and understanding that Russia and Europe will have to develop a closer engagement on, and I will talk a little bit about it in the future. So I think there is, of course, a legitimate place for looking at how Russia's role in the Middle East is seen from the Western and the European perspective. And then maybe add a little bit more of my own views on how I think Russian own kind of dynamics, internal dynamics, is going to drive its role in the region. So first of all, how does Europe see Russia's role in the Middle East? Clearly, there are, it's true what Irvin was talking about, that for Europe, 2014 was the defining moment in its relationship with Russia. Before the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, clearly there were still efforts from the European side to develop some way of convergence in relationship with Russia, although a lot of expectations of the early post-Cold War period that Russia somehow can be easily integrated both into Europe's security system and also into political and economic reality of Europe, of course, became obsolete much before 2014. Although we had a moment in time, of course, with President Medvedev's period in power, when the expectations about the partnership for modernization and greater economic integration and convergence were very much on the top of the European agenda. But clearly, with Putin's return in 2012, that has ended. And of course, we have to remember that even before the conflict in Ukraine started, we already had a speech from President Putin who clearly articulated the objective for his third term as building kind of Russia's nation-building project, which will not be the same as the West, but actually being something very distinct from the West. And that came, in 2013 and 2012, where Russia positioned itself under Putin's third presidency as a champion of kind of illiberal democracy and moving away from a partnership with the West. And of course that particularly accelerated after 2014. But in Europe there are more than 2014 reality. There are other factors that of course are also in play in the way that we look at Russia. The first one is that there is still a substantial school of thought or substantial part of Europe that considers that Russian current sort of activism and foreign policy is perhaps the last that Russia can deliver before its economic realities are going to catch up with it, because clearly we know that by all the forecasts that are being put forward by both Russian own officials and economists, Russian economy not only is going to continue to stagnate in the foreseeable future, but potentially will reduce as a share of a global economy over the next 10 years, because of course the global economy is growing much faster than 1.5% GDP per year. So Russia's capacity economically to be able to deliver both the technological revolution, which is required to remain a power in the world which is able to project its influence regionally, not let alone globally, will require both the technological advance and economic power and influence, which is not only based on capacity to quickly use military power to scale up the power, as Irvin mentioned, but also the ability to form lasting alliances and partnerships. And of course, Russia still remains very much in the position of strategic loneliness. It doesn't have many allies and friends in the world. So all of that perhaps limits the ability or interest in Europe to be able to forge a closer partnership with Russia. And then, of course, now we have a third trend, which is a relatively new one, and something which Iran has referred to, is this vision of the role of Russia for Europe in the escalating China-US tensions. You know, my former colleague from ISS, Francois Heisbourg, famously said that Russia for Europe may be bad weather, but China is a climate change. And I think this is very much how many Europeans are thinking about what is coming. And hence the speech recently from President Macron, who very clearly articulated for Europe the need to develop closer partnership with Russia, even if Russia is unlikely to become more European as once Europeans were hoped for, in the context of preventing Russia from moving closer and closer in augmenting China's ability to emancipate itself from this rather timid geopolitical player into much more assertive geopolitical and military power in the world. Because that, of course, is going to put Europe, and Irvin mentioned that Canada is in the middle, but clearly Europe is very much in the middle of the China-US strategic competition, rivalry, and potentially confrontation as we're moving forward. And here, for Europe, the role of Russia is increasingly important. Both, you know, as a player which can develop or augment or strengthen, you know, Europe's ability to remain a kind of an important global power in partnership with Russia, or also to prevent Russia from doing similar bidding for China. So, in that sense, this strategic debate is also now increasingly becoming important. So that really means that for Europe, there is no more one clear lens through which Russia is seen. It is both a potential threat after 2014 in a number of Central European countries in particular, but also United Kingdom and some of the other countries that have seen sort of intervention from Russia into its internal political issues and also recent cyber activity, that there is a concern, of course, there. There is, of course, this kind of question mark to what extent Russia will remain a major power going forward, you know, given its own internal challenges and constraints. And finally, the strategic dimensions very much looking ahead at China. So what does it mean really for Russia's role in the Middle East? I rather agree with other speakers, particularly with Iran, that I don't think Russia has a strategy in the Middle East. I think for Russia, Middle East was an opportunity, very well executed opportunity to intervene at a time when there was a vacuum in the region, and where Russia had capacity and ability to deliver quick wins. And I was at the Valdai Club meeting at the time when President Putin in 2015 actually announced intervention in Syria, and I remember very clearly he said that we are coming for a few months. That the aim of Russia's intervention in Syria was to prevent the downfall of Assad regime as the forces were moving closer to Damascus, and to perhaps put Russia back at the table post the Ukraine crisis, when the West was trying to isolate Russia, to really show and to demonstrate very clearly that Russia is still an indispensable power that needs to be at the table. But there was no ambition at that time whatsoever that Russia is coming to solve the Syrian crisis. And of course now Syria is much more of an albatross around Russia's neck than the kind of stepping stone to Russia's great power ambition. Because Russia has now inherited not only the mess that Syria is in, but also the constraints to its ability to declare victory and leave. As someone was saying, today, can Russia declare victory? President Putin has already declared victory 3 times and said that Russia is going to start, reducing its military presence in Syria. But so far, it is not able to do so. And of course, Russia's commitment now, based on the agreement with Turkey to become a guarantor of this buffer zone, security in the buffer zone in the northern Syria, is a commitment which will require a much more substantial commitment, both of forces and political capital and involvement on the ground, and with probably very few allies. And similarly, the question is whether Russia does have a vision on the political and economic future of Syria. We've seen a few initiatives from Russia, including this famous Congress of various Syrian political actors, which was held in Sochi, which has not really delivered any agreement. Astana process has not really delivered any, clear vision of a political transition and a future settlement of Syria, and the idea that you can kind of carve Syria into the sectors which will be independently managed by different actors is also something which is not going to be able to survive the future. Now we are in an even more difficult situation because Russia has delivered to President Assad a military victory, and at the same time it has to deliver him a message that it's time to go. And to think that Russia actually has capacity to enable political transition when its own credibility is on the line over the stability of Syria, I think there is a big question mark around it. And someone mentioned, I think several speakers here mentioned the issue of reconstruction. I was in Washington just recently talking about this, and the World Bank is estimating the costs of reconstruction in Syria being in the range of between $400 billion and $600 billion. No one has that money. I mean, there's no illusion. No one has that money. So Syria will not be reconstructed in any foreseeable future. Clearly, the European Union doesn't have this money, nor does China have this money. To the extent that Syria will be reconstructed, it will be done in a piecemeal kind of approach, and probably over a very, very long period of time. And here, again, Russia has very limited capacity to put something on the table. And the conversations that the Russian foreign minister and others are now having with the European Union, that Russia has stabilized Syria and now it's time for the Europeans to come in and foot the bill for the reconstruction. This is something which is not serious. Clearly, Europeans will not be considering any contribution to reconstruction until there is some clarity over the political transition. And we're going back to square one. The clarity over political transition is not there at the moment. So I think we are in a conundrum where Russia is now responsible for the future of Syria with very few instruments and cards to play. And frankly, I think very little vision over how Syria should look 10 years from now. If we look beyond Syria, and of course from the European perspective, the issue of JCPOA and Iran nuclear issue remains to be very important. And to the extent that there has been cooperation between the Europeans and Russia over the last few years, that was around the JCPOA issue, as both Russia and the EU have been committed to saving JCPOA in the face of US pull out from this agreement and reimposition of sanctions on Iran. And clearly, we've seen that both the Europeans and the Russians have failed. And from the European perspective, Russia's capacity to influence Iran and to stop Iran from restarting its nuclear program actually much more limited than what used to be the case. To some extent, it is the Europeans and perhaps their inability to deliver on its commitment of continuing economic development and economic relationship with Iran in the wake of American sanctions that could have held the cards, but they were not able to do so. And I think Russia's role there has been rather limited. And I think the question mark now, and something which was mentioned at the beginning, whether Russia will be able to, in any way, influence the future Iranian policy either in Syria or in the Middle East more broadly. Clearly, we hear, even from the Russian expert community, that there are tensions between Russia and Iran on the ground in Syria, and that there are, of course, not completely easy acceptance from the Russian side over kind of Iranian ambitions more globally in the region. And hence, we've seen recently visit by President Putin to Saudi Arabia, and sort of attempts to develop a more balanced approach for Russia around in the Middle East. But Russia's strategy so far, at least outlook for the Middle East, was based on this premise that Russia's power is sort of legitimized or derived from the fact that it's able to have relationship with everyone in the region, that it doesn't want to make any choices. But how can you have a strategic policy in a profoundly divided region on the premise that your power is based on the fact that you are simply having a relationship with everyone? Clearly, sooner or later, Russia would have to make difficult choices. So far, it has really not pointed out or gave us any clues what kind of choices it is prepared to make. And hence, it is not, in my view, a strategy. It is a kind of opportunity to, I oftentimes call a Woody Allen approach to foreign policy, because Woody Allen famously said that 80% of life is just turning up. And I think this is, in a way, in foreign policy, if you are 80% of your foreign policy power or influence is just to turn up for meetings and shaking hands with everyone, does it actually translate to the influence and real ability to have a difference in security in the Middle East? I rather question that. And final point over how is Russia's ability to project its power is going to be influenced by its domestic developments. I already mentioned that economically, clearly, Russia is going to continue to suffer a rather painful process of adaptation to a slow, stagnating economy. That stagnation not only comes from the fact that Russia has not implemented the necessary structural reforms that it had to implement to accelerate its economic growth, but also to the fact that it's continuing to be very much dependent on energy resources at a time when we are moving towards, greater acceleration of the investment in renewables and more squeeze on the consumption and demand for oil and gas resources. And that is, of course, also influenced by the fact that Russia increasingly turning to China. We know just the other day there was an opening of the Power of Siberia pipeline formally as a consumer of its energy resources. And of course that also, the fact that Russia is increasingly dependent on one consumer rather than many consumers, will probably make it harder for Russia to negotiate a very good deal for itself in selling those resources. That we have seen already the terms on which Russia has concluded that famous, $400 billion dollars, deal with China. So we are in a situation where clearly the drivers of Russian economic growth are not there. And of course they can be unlocked if finally Russia will allow the private sector to grow and to develop, and Russian middle class to grow and develop, and Russian small and medium-sized enterprises to grow and develop. But unfortunately, since 2014, the state control over the economy had strengthened, and now by various estimates, between 65% and 70% of Russian economy is directly or indirectly controlled by the state, with a shrinking resource base. So that is not a recipe for greater economic prosperity in the future. And another issue is domestic political issue. Not only that there is uncertainty over succession, as Irvin mentioned, but there is also growing reluctance from Russian public to support the expensive force projection abroad. Various opinion polls show now that, for example, on Syria, around 49% of the population now in Russia has been calling for the withdrawal of Russian troops. Around 29 or 27% recently immediate withdrawal, others, staged one, but clearly there is no support for great increase in Russian presence in Syria. And on Ukraine as well, there is really no support in population anymore for continuing, very expensive influence campaign in Ukraine. And hence we have seen really very little on Russian television over Ukraine. So with that sort of public attitudes, would Russia be able to sustain a more activist, more force projection-based foreign policy? I think there is a question mark around it. So I'll just finish here.
Thank you. Thank you, Oksana, Eran, Irvin, and Dmitry for the first round, and we have about 25 minutes. I think we were discussing global, regional, and national issues. So maybe a few things that I picked up from the things that were raised here, and we'll make another round of comments. Irvin was was talking about the term national idea related to Russia, and I was wondering how all of you are defining this term. What is the content of this term, national idea, speaking about Russia? And maybe additional issue, is there an international idea? Is the national idea connected somehow to something that Russia is offering to the world, an international idea? So this is one issue. The second, and it goes back to what Irvin, what you said that Russia has a goal and it is professionally trying to execute, to complete the mission. And Oksana was describing something that can be defined as no strategy. So how does it go together? Is there a goal? Is there a strategy? And maybe a third question that is highly connected with the first two is, how can you describe, how are you describing the decision-making process in Russia? Who makes decisions? What does Putin really knows, and how it affects the decision-making process of Russia? So we'll make it shorter this time, just a few comments, and maybe we'll still have time to receive questions from the audience. Dimitri.
Okay, thank you. About national and the international idea. Really, what Iran has said, that Russia is for a long time searching for its national idea, but I think it's an existential issue for the whole Russia for many centuries. But frankly speaking, I think that there was even a movie about the writer whose main word was, I'm looking for the new national code of existence. So, I mean, it's a real rational cultural paradigm to look for a national idea. But, and mushrooms, okay, sure. Mushrooms now everywhere, everyone is looking for mushrooms now. You know what I mean. But still, if we look at the national idea, I think that to be a world power with great culture which is delivered to the world is a national idea of Russia. It looks upon itself, even though there are many different populations, and it's not just Igdu, but it looks like the Russian world, very cultural in terms of literature, art, and so on, and a global power altogether is a kind of national idea for Russia. Whether it links to international, I think so, yes. Because as I described it, it should be delivered to the world. In terms of strategy, really, when Obama said that he would end all the forces from all over the world, including Afghanistan and so on, for several times, did he have a strategy? Did they have the strategy in 2003 when they entered Iraq? There was a strategy. Do we have here see now many countries that have or territories that have real strategies? The current U.S. administration, the current EU administration, they really have strategies. Do we have here see the political or economic strategy or some strategy in Israel now today? Really? So in terms of strategy, we're living in unstrategic world. And it's important to mention when we say Russia. Russia doesn't have strategy as well. Why not? We're part of the world. Seriously speaking, when Mr. Putin said that in few hours or months we would escape from Russia, look at every politician who would say, you know what? We're going to Syria for a couple of years at least, or maybe 5, 10. Would anybody buy it? Really? Everyone says it. Remember, all the politicians. I mean, it's a political issue to say that we come to some months and that's all. We just come to Iraq, we'll take out the Hussein and that's all. We come to Libya, we do everything and that's all. We come to everything and we'll quit. Really? Does it work? We see that it doesn't work because I really think that no politician can afford himself to say that it's a long-term strategy that they would go there and they will live there for 20, 30, 10, 5 years. It's impossible. That's why I think that these strategic or non-strategic issues, I wouldn't agree that Russia didn't have a kind of a vision, maybe not strategy, but a vision to the returning to the world. I think that it had the vision and had the aspiration to returning to the world, and of course it's used an opportunity in Syria. Of course, because there was an opportunity and Russia used it, but it wasn't totally unprepared. There was a vision and aspiration to return to the world according to the national idea that Russia is a global power that delivering its national cultural values in terms of really culture to the world. And in this way, of course, there was a part of strategic thinking. And of course, we can say that unfortunately, sometimes in its strategy and aspirations, the fear and the honor take the advantage, but mostly I would say the fear, because especially at the beginning of the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s, because when we see that the Western world didn't learn the lessons of the First World War, and when one side won the game, it doesn't respect the rights of the lost side of the game. If we assume for a while that the Cold War was won by the Western world, let's say as a general, it should have respected the Russian rights and aspirations after it won the Cold War, but it didn't. Because I was talking to several experts from US and they were saying that it was our mistake, openly saying that it was our mistake, that we understood that it was acceptable to Russia if NATO would come to the Eastern Europe, but not to the post-Soviet countries. We had to stop, but we didn't. We didn't respect the Russians' rights. And it was the fear, even though it was said openly to the world that we don't want it by the Russian establishment. So, of course, up until now, this vicious circle is on its way. And sometimes, of course, this lacks strategy and lots of blunders are making from both sides, I would say. But as for the decision makers making, well, I wouldn't say that there is one streamline from bottom to up to that brings to the decision. There are different interest groups that lobby their interests both within the country and in the foreign policy. The interesting thing is that my personal perception is that Mr. Putin likes foreign policy himself. I mean, he is interested in being in the foreign relations and being a leader in the foreign relations himself, like personally. That's why he takes maybe more let's say, time and investing more resources in understanding the situation, taking the decisions, and he takes the information from different sides. And I think that there is a kind of competition of ideas in Russia for delivering it to Putin, their different ways of understanding the foreign relations. Sometimes it comes from the, of course, different communities and social groups, from business side, from political side, from the army side, and so on. They are competing for the decision making issues, and of course putting in the peak in the end. And maybe the last comment of all I would say answer the question is interesting about the strategy and Iran. When the states went out from the JCPOA, I was speaking to one of the persons who had relation to who had an experience negotiating with Iran, and he said, "You know what? I am very unhappy with Americans that are breaking from the JCPOA. You know what? Why? Because Iranians, they are impossible partners. We had so tough time to speak to them to come to a framework, an understandable, recognizable framework in the terms of a nuclear situation. And when one card of the House of Cards was swept by the US, and the House of Cards is going to fall. And we have now to start once again to speak to Iranians. And they are very tough negotiators. It is very difficult to communicate with them. We are not strategic partners. We are not on the same page in many issues. They have their own ideas, their own understanding, and they don't count on us in many ways. And it's a big headache for us to start negotiating with them once again from the beginning.
Dimitri, thank you.
That's it.
Okay.
Toda, you asked some very good questions, so thank you very much. And they're contradictions, so I'll try to buy synthesis in there. First quick point, I just wanted to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung as well. I forgot to do that, thank you. National idea versus representations of the international order, great question. Remember, Russia is a country with 14 land borders and 3 maritime borders, one of which is an Arctic border, which we didn't discuss, which can be considered 5 or 6 additional borders. So when the Soviet Union collapses, you have 15 brand new states with new borders. All of them were, as the Russians rightly say, administrative borders before, not international borders by and large. And they each need to invent a new legitimacy for this brand new state, which in all cases is less than 30 years old. And the Russian legitimacy is the most complicated because it's the largest territory, the most multi-ethnic population, the most difficult borders. It would be as if, and I always tell my compatriots in Canada, if Canada were to fall apart, let's say the day after Quebec secession, a territory like Manitoba would have a huge western flank and a huge eastern flank, and then what is a Manitoban? They would have to invent an ideology and then look for myths in the past, and it's very much the same as the Ukrainian, Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan situation. So that's the domestic question, and it's very, very real. Do not think that the Russians have some deep continuity with Tsar Alexander II, which is my favorite Tsar. What about the international question? Well, I think here you touch on an even more germane point, which is we have contradictory understandings of what's happening in the world. And I think our representation in the West, although we speak from the victorious perspective, the most comfortable, is too simplistic. If I ask in America or in Canada or in Western Europe who won the Cold War between Reagan and Gorbachev, they would say Reagan. If I ask in Russia or Ukraine who won, they would grudgingly probably say not Gorbachev. But the answer is that between Gorbachev and Reagan, the winner was Deng Xiaoping. Right? And we seem to forget that because in North America and Israel still, I think China is regarded as the yellow barbarian, still the ones who build the railroads in North America. And yet, in my view, China is the most sophisticated, has the best judgment internationally, and is the most patient. And I'm speaking from an internal Chinese perspective, that they have studied deeply in all the languages, come home, copied, and now re-engineered and advanced. And now they're trying to keep it together from destabilization from other parties who don't understand the reality, including Russia, which understands the reality a little bit more than we do in the West. So you have these different spheres. In the Russian case, here's where I would depart a little bit from Iran. It is not right to talk about the Soviet Union or about Tsarist Russia. There is a great discontinuity in the systems and the mentality and the leadership. So just take that to heart. On the question of the goal versus the strategy versus delivering something tactically, professionally, I think that's very much par for the course in Russian behavior. There is no long-term strategy because, first of all, нет такого мышления. They don't have long-term thinking. Right now, Putin is very much an improviser, a tactician. The system does not allow for long-term, serious, credible planning. Remember how they delivered the Olympics in Sochi through 20 collapses before they finally put all the resources and scaled it up through huge losses. However, they do, in a very military way, know how to deliver an algorithm. So you have an algorithm in Syria, whatever that may be, it's tactical, we will dispatch it under pressure and because we still have the legacy of professional behavior. So I don't see a contradiction. On the decision-making process, I'll be agnostic. All that to say that I don't believe that Putin speaks with that many people in the system. He makes a lot of improvised decisions on international affairs. The system allows him to move fast and to scale. But on domestic questions, he cannot move at all.
There's one aspect of the national idea that we actually should have mentioned. Even within the borders of the Russian Federation, as more or less they remained, with the Crimea added, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a very significant set, I would be careful with my language, set of Muslim minorities, not a Muslim minority, but a number of minorities of Muslim history, with a Muslim history at least, and for some of them, as we have seen in the Chechen War, this has become a matter of identity and a challenge to the unity of the Russian Federation as such. So I think fundamental to the national idea is first of all to keep the process of disintegration that was visited upon the Soviet Union from penetrating the borders of the Russian Federation as they are now. And that actually does generate a commonality of interest against Islamist totalitarianism, Islamist radicalism as an ideology, which does also lead the Chinese to take certain actions, some of them, I would say, quite extreme, and is very much a concern of increasing elements in European society. It is certainly has been a theme in American policy, and it is, of course, very relevant to our situation as well. And interestingly enough, for example, the Russian position on the Muslim Brotherhood, not on Hamas, even more paradoxically, but on the Muslim Brotherhood, is that it is a terrorist organization. And that has created a commonality with Egypt, which is very much in our interest. Just one aspect of the larger question. So there is an element here of the national idea, which is important. As opposed to the norms and visions of a multilateral, open, universalist world, which were being put forward under the Obama administration to some extent by some European governments until recent years. And I think that the fear of these visions and their implications for the future of Russia has certainly driven this strategy, and I think we can speak of a strategy, even perhaps of a grand strategy, of resisting the emergence of an American-dominated global order with rules of the road. I think Putin is staking out, and it's very much Putin. Personally, I think with all, I've met, at least with people at the National Security Council. I think there's no question that policy is set, dominated, and implemented according to the lights of the leadership. And so the question of succession could be very relevant, true. But there is a grand strategy. The grand strategy right now is a grand strategy of resistance, of saying no to the emergence of a US-dominated Francis Fukuyama visionary world in which the liberal argument has won and the end of history is upon us. That resistance needs to be modified, I believe that's what I said earlier, by a clearer thinking about the real Russian interest in the long run. One word about Iran, I totally agree. For years, the real deep-set Russian policy has been that of a free rider. I don't believe that people in their right mind in Moscow want to see a nuclear Iran. The assumption was that somehow between the United States and Israel, someone would take care of it or just kick the can down the road and leave it to be resolved. Like the larger question of Russian orientation, I'm not sure they can avoid a decision for much longer, given the crisis that we're in.
Thank you. On this issue of visions versus strategy, I believe Genscher said if you're having visions, you should go see a doctor. I think that's quite quite a kind of, in my view, right approach to how do you articulate your foreign policy. I mean, I think we live in a world where indeed we live in a tactical world. It's not the world of great strategists, and there are various reasons for that. And I do also agree that Russia used to have a very clear strategy of resistance. But we are now outlived this, world in which United States was able, this moment in history, was able to establish kind of US-centric world. And I think it almost feels like Russia is stuck in continuing that same strategy, at least what we're seeing, both in relations to US elections, interference, similar sort of support for various far-right anti-establishment parties across Europe, that Russia continues to resist this emergence as successful democratic West, while at the same time, the reality, the world has moved on. It's not now anymore about the great democracies dominating the world. It's about the ability of the countries to become agile enough, flexible enough, and resilient enough to live in a world of rapid change. And the global order is now being shaped bottom up, not top down. And Russia is still searching for the new Westphalia. I mean, you cannot imagine how many invitations I received from various Russian conferences about, Neo-Westphalia. Let's have a great new concert of big powers sitting around the table with a big map and drawing the lines. I mean, I'm just saying, well, wake up. We live in the world of artificial intelligence. We live in the world of, rapid change, in which the real competition between China and the United States is not based on spheres of influence on the map, but it is based around the idea of who is going to be able to quicker and more strategically get access and convert to the new technology and convert it into the capability to project power. This is what will determine what the world order is going to be all about. And if that is true, that Russia is so much behind in its ability to position itself, through that, strategy of, undermining, Western democracy. It has to one day think about whether it is tactically or strategically, develop its own ability to compete in that world of bottom-up strategic, power sharing. And in this world, what Russia really needs is, economy, which is able to exist outside of the oil and gas sector, population which is able to generate good technology and realize it at home, not go to Silicon Valley or Israel, and realize it there. And then finally, its ability to have good relationship with all different players around the world, because the alliances of the future will be much more faster moving than they are today. And not, the position of strategic loneliness is not a good one to be able to compete in this new global reality. So when will Russia eventually move from that kind of Neo-Westphalia to kind of much more, resilience-based approach to global order? I mean, clearly not in the near future, in my view.
Thank you very much. We have maybe time for one question from the audience. Yes.
We look at all these kind of problems, but I think actually that the biggest problem for Russia is the negative demographic problem.
Thank you. Maybe quick comments from Irvin.
Actually, I want to talk about New Westphalia, but I'm just kidding. Here I will bring in the Arctic, because we didn't discuss, the Arctic, in my view, is one of three major interstitial theaters in the world that have yet to be governed by some superstructure. One of them is the Middle East, or Eastern Mediterranean as a subset, as Eran said. The second one is Ukraine, or that broader space between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union. By the way, watch for this Uzbekistan potential joining of the Eurasian Union, so it's an interesting moment. And the third one, the giant one, is the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic joins all the great powers, China, the United States, Russia, and Canada, by definition, to survive, will have to be of that of that ilk. That's why I posit that Canada either has a great power future or no future, because we'll be crushed by all these powers. Now, if you look at the demography of Russia in that game, they're in the best position. They have 100 million people living on the southern border. They have 50 million people living in the central axis, and they have 4 million people living on the Arctic, which puts it in the best position. In the Canadian case, we have 38 million people. We have 35 million on the southern axis with the United States. We have 2 million in the middle, and we have a total of 115,000, which is probably the size of Ashdod or something, living across a territory the size of the European Union. So from that perspective, Russia's in a good place. From the European and Chinese perspective, then Russian demography is not as favorable. And there, I would say that where Russia's has some chance to, although not in the long run, it has some improvisational chances that it can do through what I call their scaling and their inventiveness. They can give passports very quickly to a different country. They can give land away. They could do all sorts of incentives that regular bureaucratic states cannot do. Like Canada, we have difficulty managing what seems to be a big demographic crisis in a vulnerable territory, even though we have huge immigration. So just as a counter thesis.
Okay, any other comment?
I would just say that Oksana is absolutely right about the economy. If there will be change in demographic dynamics, they will only come against the background of people being more hopeful for their children than they are for themselves looking down the road. As long as this is not the case. This is the case in Israel, by the way, which has the most remarkable demographic dynamics in the Western of any Western society. But unless things change for the average Russian, in the countryside, not in Moscow, where all the riches of Russia seep into, unless that happens, the demographic challenge will remain, and it will become more severe, internally and externally.
Thank you very much, Dimitri, Irvin, Eran, and Oksana. You're leaving us with many thoughts for the continuing of the conference. Thank you.